Hello, everyone, and welcome to the live stream for Tuesday, December 7th, 2021, as we bring the year, or at least start to bring the year to a close. Today, as indicated in the header image for the stream, I want to address a couple of things that are happening behind the scenes here at the show and leave the floor open for any questions that you might have along the way. So feel free to drop those in the chat if you would like, and I will respond as I'm able throughout the evening. So, if you've been with me for a while, in June of 2020, amidst the global pandemic, I came back to the show full time and was doing a lot of work on getting new episodes out and just back into the flow of working on the show as my primary endeavor. The days are long and the years are short, Jason, for it being Tuesday. And I was expecting that with the show and coming back to it, that even among the pandemic, that it would be a couple of months and then be able to launch some of the projects that I had been putting together and planning. Though, of course, as we now know, the world has continued to be ravaged by COVID, and opening and closing and everything that goes with it continues to be in flux. And so, because of family members who were immunocompromised and some others, I delayed engaging in some of these other projects until things were going to be safer for myself and my family. Now, finally, it seems like in 2022, some of those are going to start reopening again, as I will be in Asheville the beginning of the spring to record some in-person conversations and a site tour, as well as visit a site that I'm looking to use for an in-person workshop in September. But just to go visit and check that out. And so with that, September then, outside of Asheville, I'm looking to run a workshop from September 7th through the 11th, 2022, in person on ecological design and literacy, as a first look at this way that I've been dividing up the permaculture design course into a hands-on practical application for students to learn what they need to practice permaculture in their day-to-day life, and then a practicum as the other 2/3 of the PDC for students to apply these ideas more deeply to their personal context and where they live, and be able to complete the rest of the PDC in a context that makes sense for them and that can be place-based regardless of where they are in the world, and have my knowledge, experience, and backing to help them through that process, so that we can create a dynamic classroom that is driven more by discussion and student interest than necessarily being stuck on one core educational model. Similarly, I am looking at, as that is a piece that is in person for the end of next year, doing a complete permaculture design course in this new model divided into the two sections in 2022. I don't have an exact date on that, but it's something that I'm working on here in December and early January, as that's part of my kind of being back to it when it comes to the show. That, I came back and was looking at doing this full time in 2020. And as I say, there was a lot of stuff that was planned in person, and the pandemic prevented me from feeling comfortable still engaging in those. Then earlier this year, I took the extended sabbatical to work on getting myself right with the show and understanding what it was that I really wanted to work on in this space. And then that's where, when I came back several months ago and shared, wanting to do 45 long format episodes, 1 or 2 series to explore that idea, these live streams on a more regular basis, is where all of that kind of came together. Now that I've been back to this for a couple of months and continue to work on that business development so that I can find the comfortable sustainability that I've been looking for, behind the scenes, taking the time to implement a lot of that and figuring out the ways to make that work. And so in December, and early January, if you're visiting the podcast website, you'll see the support page return to list all the ways that people can get in touch with the show through Patreon and um, yeah, with Patreon, or to make direct donations, or any of those different ways that people can support the show. I'm also putting together a calendar page. I looked at running an app to do that, but I don't find that many of them give the amount of information that I was looking for, in order to be able to make it like month by month and then content focused. So looking at creating a calendar page to list what's coming up. At the moment, it's likely to focus on class start dates and things that aren't part of the show proper, but this could also be a place for me to list the topics and dates and times for upcoming live streams if they're known. And that's one place. If you're tuning in for the live streams and there's something you'd like covered in an upcoming episode, certainly feel free to drop me a line. You can text 717-827-6266. Send me an email at the show address, show@thepermaculturepodcast.com. The live streams have really been a place to work on addressing different pieces that don't make it into the regular format of the show. And I'd be happy to add much more to this space based on what your interests or questions are, or if there's topics that you'd like me to cover that make sense in a shorter format like this. Yeah, there's TA says so much is up in the air for 2022. I'm still negotiating with a lot of the organizations that I'm partnering with for the year ahead and making sure that we have good cancellation policies in place because of COVID and the possibility of next year being a repeat of this year or the year before, so that we can still at least continue to plan and prep for these kinds of things, even if the possibility of actually launching them is, not 100%. Similarly, a lot of conferences that I had on my schedule for next year are now largely virtual. Oh, let me turn that off real quick. And some colleagues and I who are looking at hosting some conferences are similarly back to virtual, not only because of COVID, but also for accessibility and making them more open to someone from anywhere in the world. But yeah, just that face-to-face, person-to-person connection in classes and conferences. I don't know when, if ever, we're going to return to what was that kind of a normal, but I look forward to at least continuing to plan and try. Yeah, on that calendar page, I may also be able to do episode release dates. I'm recording usually 3 months ahead of when an episode is released, and so based on that, could put together a list of when episodes are expected to come out. I don't want to necessarily give hard dates for everything, so that I do have some flexibility behind the scenes, like with the Permaculture Land and Land Access series that didn't quite go as planned. I totally forgot about Thanksgiving, and that for Thanksgiving for my family and I, that's over really more like 6 days, and then being a little ill. But being able to give some kind of a framework for when these different pieces will be happening. With that, look for some class pages to come up. Probably, a drop-down menu on the website that says classes, and then you can see permaculture practicum, ecological literacy, and design, and all of those from that drop-down, and be able to select and go directly to the course that you like, with each of those pages then hosting a general description. If there are dates for when those are planned to be available, you'll find those on that page. You'll find those on those pages in addition to the calendar page, and then likely to have a sign up there as well, so that if you're interested in getting updates, you can have your name added to the appropriate mailing list so I can reach out to you. Similarly, when it comes to classes and workshops, if you're not a Patreon supporter, patrons do have first access to classes currently, and often those are presented with a discount. So if that's something that you're interested in, certainly consider joining the Patreon community at patreon.com/permaculturepodcast. Related to classes, the homeschooling program and this idea of doing like permaculture enrichment for homeschoolers has had a lot of traction and interest. And in order to meet those needs, I'm going to be spinning that off into its own Patreon as a place to host some of the material that doesn't go into that class and help provide a community for homeschooling families where they can come together, get to know each other, and connect around this core idea. With that, I'll be sharing more about the homeschooling piece via the podcast over the next couple of months as that comes together, but eventually do see that being separated from the podcast and not nearly as prevalent in that work, though I will still include children in permaculture in the live streams, likely once a quarter, and then looking to host some like homeschool education support calls for families who listen to the show, similarly about once a quarter. Those are a lot of the main updates that you'll see like visible from the front side of the show in the near future. Building up over December and early January, I am looking to finally figure out how to use MailChimp well. I do not like the UX for that. Jason, if you're still here with your work in UX design, MailChimp has just reminded me of how much a terrible design can keep you from wanting to use a product or to be interested in doing so. But as I look at how powerful MailChimp is for being able to get information out, spending some time with that. So if you are on the mailing list, you'll see some messages coming from me here in the next, as I say, month or two, with some surveys and seeking your feedback, as well as then what I would like to do once I get more comfortable with that system is go back to permaculture news newsletters, where once or twice a month I send out a brief newsletter that kind of gives a survey of where permaculture is in the news around the world. Also as a place for people who are permaculture practitioners, if you'd like to share your services or list your classes, that I can include those in there as well so that people know what's coming up. I used to do some episodes like that were shorter about permaculture in the news, but the current space and direction of the show, I don't see that as being a good fit, and that instead the newsletter is a better place for that. Similarly, continuing to include other updates in that space about what's going on with classes and courses and things like that. No, Jason, I have not tried many of the others. They're all, the couple that I touched when I was looking at MailChimp as an option were all kind of terrible, and MailChimp just seemed like it was the best one at the time. And so I figure if I figure out how to use it, I will not hate it as much, and I can use it more regularly, more quickly. But there are so many options when it comes to landing pages and CRM and being able to drip content, as well as sending stuff out like on a calendar or all of that. It's just, there's a lot of utility there that I need to explore. Also behind the scenes, a piece of hardware that I'm working on setting up a bunch of hardware to make my editing process quicker, being able to program macros and things like that, as well as adding some new software to the mix. Oh my gosh, I didn't need to know that. MailChimp is a shining UX god among email newsletter services. That's terrible. It's awful. Like, if I could find a newsletter service that it's terrible. That's I will just learn how to use it and get over this. But I have added recently a programmable keyboard with profiles to my hardware setup to ease the editing process, looking at some new software to do so. Also looking with like OBS as this we move into 2022, if there is more feedback on what folks would like for live streams, being able to do more with the stream deck so that we can have graphics and move through those as well. Similarly with graphics, looking to add a pen display to my hardware. I've got one on order. I need to double check all of my hardware when it comes in to make sure that I don't need to order any DisplayPort cables or anything like that, but adding one of those, because then I can use that as a source when live streaming to be able to draw directly on the screen as we're talking about things. Also to be able to do that for classes as well, and add more dynamic content to the experience. Yeah, and just continuing down this process of pulling together all of these disparate pieces to continue to deliver content regularly via the podcast while growing the classes and courses that appear to be the pieces that will provide the stability so that I can continue working in this space and doing this work. With where episodes are at the moment, it's been a lot of fun to record interviews in batches and be able to project out into the year. The series with Rosemary Morrow, we recorded 8 sessions together, and that's around 12 or 13 hours of raw audio. I don't know what that's going to look like, how I'm going to parse it up and get it out there, because there's just so much. And what's really great about it to me is it's like sitting at the table with Rosemary while she's talking about the core concepts of permaculture and why it matters, why it's important. There are some pieces that I don't know how I can edit around because of some of the candor we had as we were talking, but her perspective on the history of permaculture and what Bill and David offered the world, why after all of these years permaculture is still what matters to her and what is important, which was really fascinating, because permaculture for her is the discipline that has all of it that we need to build a beautiful world and to respond to climate change and refugee issues and all these other pieces that we're going to be actively engaging in, now and more fully year after year in the decades ahead. And that's kind of, the more that I look at this work, as long as it can remain relevant, which is another conversation, but as long as permaculture can remain relevant and a part of the regular conversation, there is a lot of good that it can do in the world. And there's a lot of that comes through in Rosemary's work. We'll definitely, we have them recorded, so whatever happens, there will be material that comes out from that. I was able to raise the funds to get at least that material turned into podcasts and released for the show, and released through the show in cooperation with Meliadora Publishing and some other partners. As the fall or end of year fundraiser continues, if we're able to bring some more together, then that may be able to grow and expand. But right now, it is looking like it will just be the conversations with Rosemary and my commentary. But yeah, I'm still hopeful that we'll be able to bring in some of her friends and colleagues from around the world to add their voices to that conversation. If not, Rosemary continues to share folks who I should get in touch with me, who I can always have back on the show at a later date to continue those kinds of conversations. Similarly, it was fun. Eric Tonesmeyer and I sat down this past Friday and were able to record material for 2 separate interviews while also just getting a chance to catch up. And it's really exciting to hear about all the projects he's writing and working on. He finally has a Patreon up and running that appears to be going pretty well, and he'll be releasing 2 books next year, the first of which will be a PDF which is a survey of trees with edible leaves from all around the world. based on their nutrition. So it's not just about like what can you eat as a forageable or as a survival food, but is something that actually fills in a space in our diet in a meaningful way. And yeah, when we were talking, that was fascinating how much he learned about the nutrition of these leaves and the vitamins and minerals that are available from them, and that many of them are ones that we can find in our backyard or in our community around us. They also often are easy to coppice and keep at a relatively small size so you can be harvesting from them regularly. Just a lot of exciting information in that. That conversation will be out in probably late March or early April, and that conversation, when that comes out, will also come out around the same time as the PDF book on that subject. The other conversation we had was around alley cropping and what that looks like around the world and the lessons that he's been learning along the way. And from that, he's working on a book in cooperation with a nonprofit, which should be to print hopefully about a year from now, so late next year, discussing alley cropping and the ways that we can use that to sequester carbon, to grow crops in an integrated way, protect waterways. Again, the conversation was awesome, but the book sounds like it's going to be even more amazing when it's finally released out into the world. Similarly, building on the conversations for the Permaculture Land and Land Access series in two different directions. One of the folks who I learned about during that conversation, from Amy Rose Full, Taylor Scott, and I sit down here next week to have a conversation about that work of hers and community fridges, which is really exciting to me because of all of the community pantries, like little food pantries that are here where I live in Falls Church, that being able to put a refrigerator out where people have public access to it to drop off food or pick up food radically changes food access and what we can put out there for people, especially for those of us who are growing food, to be able to harvest and collect and store in a cold space is, yeah, just really exciting. And then there are some other conversations I've recorded that will be out next year that may be touching a bit more on the controversial side of some of the things of permaculture, about what it mean, what does design really mean, what is the role of the permaculture design course. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to sharing those with you to move the conversation about permaculture and what permaculture is forward. There are also I'll be sitting down with some colleagues. We're working on creating a new organization for outreach within the permaculture and regenerative spaces. We're recording a conversation about that this Thursday, which should be out in early January, to announce that to the world and let folks know how they can get involved. There's just so many amazing moving pieces. I finally decided to look at creating a permaculture institute under a nonprofit umbrella, so that the certificates that I issue for permaculture design courses can come from an organization that is more diverse than just me and my expertise. In doing that, I've reached out to some colleagues in the community about having them come and be guest instructors through these classes, online and offline. So I have my first guest instructor for the online PDC lined up, which I'll share once that goes live and we're 100% confirmed that they can join us, as well as an in-person guest instructor for the workshop in Asheville in September of next year. So yeah, there's a lot going on and moving while trying not to add too much to my plate so that I can still continue to deliver on what I promised. Ooh, excuse me. I want to make sure that the 45 long format episodes come out this year, that these live streams continue, and be able to continue layering information and in ways that make the most sense where they have the best reach. And yeah, just keep on keeping on and putting all this together. But it's really, I think what's really exciting about it is that between the conversations with Rosemary Morrow, some of my other colleagues within the community, there are a lot of different ways to make this work that I hadn't considered before, but that I don't think I would be in this place or being able to think about this or make these kinds of decisions if it were not for deciding to come back to the show in the middle of the pandemic and not being able to do what I wanted to do at the time. Stepping back and going on sabbatical for a while and really looking at what is it that I want to do in this space. What does the podcast mean and what should the podcast do? And in answering that, I became a lot more comfortable with narrowing that focus in that way. Continuing the conversation with friends who are in the community and also working as so many others are in cobbling a lifestyle together and a living, understanding how they've been doing it. Getting an idea of the unacknowledged resources that are available for individuals in the permaculture community who are doing this work full time but not necessarily talking about how they're making it work. Between, permaculture was a second or a third job after retirement, or they come from a previous career that allows them to pick up contract work for 6 weeks or a couple of months and that pays all their bills. And looking at the way that those folks are doing it, I only know 2 or 3 people who are making a living from their permaculture and regenerative work full time from just really one kind of narrow focus. Everybody else is picking and choosing and using all these different resources and approaches. I mean, even myself, I lived in the gift economy for a long time, and so I didn't have rent or a mortgage, and surfing friends' couches and things like that allowed me to live on very meager resources. But then understanding it's like now here I am in Northern Virginia, not in the same space. That it requires a different approach. And how do we do that? And thankfully my colleagues have provided feedback about how they've been making their livings cobbling it together. And yes, Jason, you're not wrong. There are a lot of different ways to make it work, or that it could work. And many of my meandering sessions, the first 15 or 20 minutes are spent breaking down the fact that the idea of take one, teach one, or take one and go become a designer isn't really a viable path. That even taking the PDC with all the information that it does provide, it still takes like 2 to 5 years of concentrated effort to gain the skills to be a high quality teacher or high level designer. And yeah, you can slog out and do it on your own, but getting there is not always easy. And very often, yeah, it's just pulling things together, and that all the models that are available to permaculture practitioners are just that. They are ways that other people have made this work, and we need to be examining that, finding the pieces that work, pulling it all together, and making something that is appropriate for ourselves. And that right now that's not there. But it also goes back to like what David had said to me about taking permaculture and applying it to what we already do. And that it's not necessarily about just forging out on our own, but how can we apply it to what we're already working on? What are the ways that this system of design can improve our life and our quality of life right now without needing to necessarily be on the land and grow food? even though, I think that growing food is fantastic and a very liberating experience, there are different ways that permaculture can manifest in the world, and that we need to be talking about that now so that people who are coming into this have a better idea of what it's actually like. But I mentioned David because of what he had said about, that we should have a series of permacultures, and then that looking at Bill's writings in Permaculture Designer's Manual, that seems to fit. Like chapter 14 is all this other stuff that we can do to create a meaningful and viable society that just kind of fell by the wayside, I think, because of the way that Bill taught this information to the world as a primarily land-based practice. But it was part of the discussions with Rosemary Morrow that reinforced that even further, that permaculture needs to be something taught to everyone as widely as we can, that in the face of climate change and climate catastrophe, that builders will have an idea of how to place windows so that it's easier to cool a building with nighttime breezes, or to block off that solar radiation during the hottest part of the day. Yeah, and having our city planners to think this way and have a holistic approach to what it is that they're doing. But it also kind of goes back to, like, how should we teach permaculture? In the last live stream about permaculture in business, we talked some about whether or not permaculture should be taught at the collegiate level. And looking at the model of what's happening in Australia, they have something known as the Tafe system, TAEF, if I recall correctly. And from what I took away from that is that the Tafe system in Australia is comparable to a vocational school or a community college where you go and learn, practical skills for the work that you're going to be doing. And the way that the TAFE system is working in Australia is that people can go through that program and then are being hired as permaculture practitioners to be working on issues of sustainability and landscape restoration and all these other pieces that are super important if we're going, just to get from where we are. But the early days of permaculture and the anti-academic approach that Bill took, I feel that still kind of haunts the perspective of permaculture, and needing to have conversations like this today so that, maybe in 3 or 4 years we will start to see permaculture as an interdisciplinary system taught at some level. I know that Monica from Beyond Organic Design was working to teach this at the high school level, which I thought was fantastic, and that's also part of where, I continue to be drawn back to teaching children permaculture from a young age so that they can be thinking this way throughout their lives. I look at the changes to the math system with Common Core, and as frustrating as it can be for me as a parent to teaching my children math with this system because of how I was taught, my children have a knowledge of numbers and mathematics that is natural in a way that is just shocking and surprising, and the way that they bring it all together and relate it to the world around them. And that's where I'd like to see whole systems thinking and these permaculture ideas integrated into childhood education, so that we don't just continually come to this as adults later in life and then trying to find a way to adapt everything that we're doing around it, that this is just a lens through which we see the world. I see, Jason and TA, you've gotten into some conversations about capitalism and money and some other things. Let me look at these real quick. All right, this is I. If we were having this conversation at the earlier in the day, I might want to weigh in on economics, but perhaps we should take that conversation back to Twitter, and we can then respond to that asymmetrically as we are able. Um, I think I've covered kind of. Oh no, TA, don't mind. This is exactly what these spaces are for, so that we can be members of the community and be having these conversations. It's just I've already put in quite a long day, and I would love to have a conversation about this, about economics and permaculture, particularly from, like, yeah, like I have a political perspective. I come from a worldview. When it comes to, like, Jason's mention of the Jubilee, having grown up, as I mentioned in a recent episode, in one of the historic peace churches, there are, yeah, there are a lot of different ways to talk about this. And I think that, well, I enjoy conversation. And communication can be something beautiful yet difficult. And I mean, Jason, it was one of the things you and I were talking about recently about positive versus negative support for people, and as and restorative justice and some of those pieces. I feel very deeply that we can talk our way through a lot of issues, and that from most of my experience, we are usually closer to one another than what divides us. But how can we speak in a way that shares our ideas and allows a conversation to develop? And what we've been going through recently about vaccines and vaccine mandates on Twitter, I think, is a great example. I like the one person who we've been exchanging with because they have a perspective and are supporting it with the evidence that they've come to. We may not agree with the conclusions that they've developed from those sources, or why the sources that we present might not be something that they accept or consider, um, valid or viable. But if we can continue the conversation and deepen our understanding of one another, we can keep working together. And that's where a lot of this for me, there's this analogy that I think I've used in a live stream a couple times, and I don't recall where I first heard it from at the moment, but about riding the bus together. And it's with someone who has views that are as unique and radical as my own, shall we say, that there are a lot of times that I wish that we could just ride the bus with one another. That if you're working on issues of community gardens and food security, let me hop on your bus and ride it with you and help you get to where you're going. And we can have conversations along the way. When it's my stop, I'll hop off. When you reach your stop or I reach mine, we'll hop off and get on the next bus that takes us further along this journey. And in doing so, be able to ride that bus with our friends and colleagues and people who are working with us. But it's still something that I'm working on. And how can we have these conversations in a public space and do a public discourse that doesn't devolve to shoutings or no's or swearing? And I have some of my methods, but yeah, I would rather have discourse in a way that is meaningful so that we can all grow and learn from each other than just to shut down the discussion. With the exception of Nazis and supremacists, but that's another conversation that I just yeah. Anyway, now that I've gone through all of that and wound up at Nazis and supremacists, is there anything else that those of you who are here with me in the moment would like to throw into the chat for me to respond to in the time that we have remaining, or should we take this to some of these? I would definitely take this conversation about economics, particularly like the biblical jubilee, weigh in a little with Christian anarchism on Twitter. Jason, I know we follow each other there. We're friends everywhere. For those of you who aren't part of that space, you can find me at Permaculture Pod. Yeah, and if you'd like to talk about economics and some of these other pieces, I'm happy to dig into those there. Oh, hey Nathan, great to see you. It's been a while since we've been in touch. I try not to engage with trolls, but if someone comes to the table and appears to be having a conversation in good faith, I will remain in that conversation as long as that appears to be the case. But once it starts to get really weird or something like that, I personally don't see a reason to continue that conversation. But if we're having a dialogue to understand differences in perspectives, or because someone can come to the table and say, I don't know enough about this to have a good conversation about it. I'm ignorant about this. What would you recommend I read? What would you recommend? What are your suggestions? What are your thoughts on this? I am more than happy to make time for people. And that's where, like this conversation we were having on Twitter about medicine and things. One of my family members was a nephrologist, so I grew up at the knee of a medical doctor. Medical science saved my mother's life years before I was born because she received a kidney transplant in the mid 1970s and is now one of the longest lived kidney transplant patients in the world. I was born years after her transplant. Still in the 70s, just for those of you who oh, didn't know or were wondering where I landed on that. And so that was a space where if I ever had any questions about medicine, I had someone who would talk to me about it at any age. Didn't care that I was a child and always treated me with respect in the process. One of my earliest mentors when I was 8 taught nuclear physics and nuclear chemistry at Caltech. He happened to be the husband of my mom's boss in the restaurant industry, but again, always treated me with respect and answered my questions to the best of his ability and did what he could to convert this really high order crazy stuff to me as an 8-year-old. And that definitely had an influence on me, and wanting to make information accessible to try to meet people where they're at and understand where they're coming from and have just dialogues, because the social side of the permaculture stuff is just hard, deeply distinctly hard. Having lived in an intentional community, trying to figure out how to live together as 3 adult men, 2 of us with multiple children of various ages, and maintain our other social relationships while building up this community space and the people who are around us. There's a lot of talking, a lot of shared meals, lots of times in the backyard with a whiteboard, making notes, trying to express what worked and what didn't work. And ultimately we weren't able to save that project because of the direction where the homeowner needed to go. But I'm thankful for that experience and for us to have spent that time together. I look at, if we're going to answer a lot of these big problems, needing to bring more people to the table and being in a space that we can talk with folks, but not get defensive if they say something that doesn't agree with our worldview or perspective on this, and try to find the lessons that are from it. It's the restorative justice movement means a lot to me in doing this as well, because it's easy to screw up or to upset someone in ways that are just completely unintentional. And being able to create ways or have ways for people to be able to return to the communities that we're building or that we're a part of. yeah, there's a lot in this space and like all of my experiences that inform my permaculture practices. And yeah, it pulls from a lot of different places to get from where I started to where I am now. But all of that is still a part of me. And it's these different pieces and wanting to share that with folks and to dig in a little bit deeper about, you know, growing up in a radical historic peace church and being taught anti racism by racists because they didn't want me to be like them. Having family members who, well, aren't here because of the Holocaust, and those who did survive, and the lessons that came from that. And yeah, there's a lot more for me to bring to the table in the months and years ahead that haven't been a part of the podcast proper that I would like to share with you. And so, yeah, don't mind me. This kind of speaking extemporaneously in the moment is interesting to put all of these pieces out there, especially TA with you. As far as I know, that we don't know each other. Nathan, I know you and I have talked and on different occasions and have met in person several times. Jason, you and I are friends, online, offline, real world, everywhere in between. But that, yeah, there are a lot of pieces of myself that I haven't brought to the conversation that I think need to be. Um, so yeah, there may be some more of that. But yeah, Nathan, intentional communities are super hard. Like, I love the idea. I love what I learned from, my brothers when in that house and bringing tons of folks together. But yeah, it's just a lot of work. And to build the world that we want is work. And it's a lot. And I don't want to say that it's hard or difficult. It's just continuous and ongoing. Um, the and I saw that reflected in the intentional community, in our months together, and that was its own experience. I look at, coming from a large family and what we did there to make it work, though that was certainly more hierarchical, because I had a matriarch, on my maternal side, on my mother's side of the family. My maternal grandmother was certainly the matriarch of the family, and we saw that once she passed away. Um, but even when it comes to my friendships and or my marriage to my wife, we spend a lot of time talking continuously. Lots of check-ins during the day. Hey, how are you? With my friends, that's a text message or a quick message on, Discord. My wife and I work through what our days are, by email when she's out of the house, and at the office, so that like if I run certain errands, she knows that we do dinner planning and things together, and the way that continual contact deepens those relationships and makes it easier. I think that honestly, um, if my I have a set of real world offline friends. I don't know how I want to say that because I do have some friends who are virtual as well who I've never met in person. But there is a group of offline friends, people who I know in the real world, who I think that I could probably make a pretty good go at an intentional community with now. But that certainly comes from the lessons that I learned having been in one and what didn't work there and what did. Knowing that this particular group of friends, we tend to share a lot of the same perspectives in the world, um, like politically, and when it comes to how to organize systems and governance versus government, and all of that really helps that process too. But there are also people who I feel like if we were working with folks who didn't share those perspectives exactly, that we could still find a way to parlay with each other. So, um, sorry, let me look back in this chat. I've been kind of going on a bit here again. TA. Oh, excuse me. One of those nights. Let me take a sip. I think TA, the lessons from that intentional community could certainly be something long form. I I find that I am not that writer, and many of the larger writing projects that I had in mind are, well, I set by the wayside for now. I may come back to them later. I'm just not sure. There's a mix of reasons for that, but I find that I would rather create an outline for a live stream on the lessons or my lessons from living in an intentional community and speak to it from that perspective. Um, these are the realms that I prefer to work in. The written word isn't that piece for me. It's also a large part of why I study storytelling and oral traditions because I've used my voice for more than a decade to communicate a wide variety of ideas, and that's just where I feel the most comfortable. If that is something that you'd like more about, I'd be happy to see about putting some podcasts together or setting one of the future topics of a live stream to my lessons from an intentional community. Yeah, Nathan, I can see how trying to make one can be difficult and harmful. I look a lot to like Dunbar's number and traditional hunter-gatherer societies, what we have from both the anthropological record and yeah, just a wide host of sources. And I do think that there is both a minimum required size for an intentional community as well as a maximum. I, th- from my lessons of living with the group that I did, I find that we would have benefited from a slightly larger core group. I know that we had been working on that with the idea that there were the three of us who lived at the house, and then there was a ring of additional people who spent a lot of time there, but that never the difficulties of living together collectively without so closely as three fully grown adult men. Um, it was yeah that we would have been I think that we would have worked that it would have worked better if we had more space at the house and there were probably three more people at a minimum living there with us full time to kind of spread the social and emotional load of the house across a larger group. We had a lot of amazing celebrations and dinners and people who would come over and join us for things. Really enjoyed teaching some classes and workshops there, having gardening days together that really felt good, but there was still a separation from the core group living in the house. Our close friends who would come around us and spend time with us, and then there was the broader community who would come around for like our festival days and things, which were awesome. And they were very supportive, but we just never quite found the right mix. Um, and that's where, like, as a minimum number, six probably would have made that house work, but I think 8 to 10 as a core group is ideal. With a church, like my wife's church, as she's Orthodox, her church is probably too large, I think, to try to create an intentional community out of because there are just so many members. And so, who could I find within that group who would be interested um, to develop something from a spiritual perspective and find the space that we all agree on that are the core driving principles of the community? Um, well, TA, since you've listened for a long time, though we don't know each other, I look forward to us being able to spend more time together on live streams and elsewhere, and perhaps we can get to know each other. I think yes, I believe you are on the Discord and Patreon, so there's some other places there we can interact. You do not bring forth will destroy you. Yeah, the Gospel of Thomas verse that you shared, Jason, reminds me of some of our conversations about, making the deal with the beast and compromising our our, I don't want to say morals, that's not quite what I mean, but the sacrifices that we make in order to live in the world as it is. And what can we do to bring out more and in the world as it exists. There's that idea that Taj Shakluna shared that perhaps a fourth ethic of permaculture is that we're in a world that we live in a world in transition, and that it's not necessarily possible for us to have everything that we want. I mean, if I knew that I could go build a shelter away from civilization, but if I had a toothache, I could still come to town and get my dental work done or replace my glasses every few years, I think I would drop out as much as I could. I am called to hermitage and being that man on the edge of the village, and that's continues to be the space that I feel the most comfortable in. But I tell my stories here and via the podcast, and anything we can do to continue to draw forth what is within us, I am always happy to work on. And Nathan, yes, your experiences in Burkina Faso. I took a college level, I sat in on a college level lecture on the different aspects of cultures around the world, and it's interesting, but the range between individualism and collectivism, and how if I remember right, it was like 5 different axes in different cultures that this person had identified, and where cultures fall in between on these 5 different axes, and what that means for these different cultures, and that the United States is not the most individualistic culture in the world, but it's pretty close. And I see a lot of that in our conversations and politics right now, which I still I toss a lot around. And just wonder how we can live more communally in the United States, even if we can't necessarily live collectively, and what would that look like? I can say the intentional community that I was a part of didn't collapse due to drug abuse, thankfully. It really came down to that we shared the same vision and ideal, but we were not quite on the same page on how that should look in reality and in practice. And so, because there wasn't, for 2 out of the 3 of us, we didn't have a stake in the home. It was owned by one of the individuals, and that created some hierarchy, structure, and expectations that, for those of us who didn't have the stake, were not necessarily interested in participating in. We were looking for something a bit flatter for us to enjoy. And then the homeowner was in a place where they needed to move on from that space. And so we moved on with it. Once that became aware, the one community member left, and then I left like 2 or 3 months later. But I still, I'm deeply thankful for the experience and what it taught me. I have consulted with some people who are interested in forming intentional communities in Pennsylvania, Jason, based on what you were saying about that. Trying to form an intentional community is an extended and exacting education in every way in which your intentions are not quite the same. And much of my consulting with people who are interested in forming an intentional community has been around take the time to get real clear personally with what it is you are looking for. And willing and able to what you are looking for within the intentional community, the needs that it will meet, and then what you will be able and willing to provide to the intentional community, and then have everybody who's interested in doing this have a do that deep self-analysis, and then come back to it as a group conversation and talk and share and talk and share and talk and share and talk and share. That it is something that takes time and is not something to jump into. Though there are conversations that get into about governance versus government, and even all but the most individualistic anarchist theorists have some kind of governance or ways in which the community makes decisions. And so I'm not opposed to governance and being able to make and having an outline of how you will make decisions collectively. But that's where, with an intentional community, as after you've talked and talked and talked and talked and talked, having bylaws that you can put in place that are ideally in writing, yes, so that everyone in the community can see them. That updates have to happen in the public space. That, you have to have some kind of a meeting before those are changed that requires some kind of a supermajority, ideally, so that it's more difficult for the community to fracture and factionalize. But it still comes back to communicate, and work all that in and figure it out. So and that's the space that I come from, Jason. What you just posted, that there are non-hierarchical forms of governance. I don't think governance is poison, but hierarchy is. That's kind of the space that I come from. The governance and some way to be able to make decisions should exist within a community, and be accessible. There's Murray Bookchin, I think it was The Next Revolution. I don't remember if I mailed that to Doug yet or not. Our good friend Doug Underhill, I believe I promised that to, and I don't remember if I sent it to him or not. But it's one of the pieces that Bookchin gets into. Hey man, TA, have a good one. I will catch you around. And if you want to catch me on Twitter, at Permaculture Pod, if you'd like to get into the economics conversation. Jason, that piece about governance, it was Bookchin talks about community councils that are open to the public. Anybody in the community can come be a part of it, and be able to participate. But if people choose not to participate, then that's fine. I saw that JD San, and that's there's order and there's predator and prey and things like that, but it's, what do you mean by hierarchy in that sense? Anyway, when it comes to governance, being able to participate, being able to choose not to participate, just a lot of different pieces in it. We could probably spend hours and hours discussing different forms of governance or decision making, why some things are more effective than others, why I think that nonviolent communication is a really important tool to be able to communicate, while at the same time I've also found that nonviolent communication is one of the most violent forms of communication that I have ever encountered, because of the ways that it can be used to gaslight and minimize and decenter responsibility, through the tools that are used within nonviolent communication. Um, but yeah, and that's, I don't think that there's any one particular answer that is ideal. And I keep, as with Rosemary Morrow, I keep coming back to permaculture because for me it's what makes the most sense right now. And I'm likely to, um, you know, I will likely continue this practice for the rest of my life, but I don't know that permaculture is what will be the solution, 50 or 100 years from now, but it works really well for now. Um, but I like permaculture because it rejects the idea of a one size fits all approach to anything, and that it is about finding what works in your local context, in the community that you're a part of, with the people who are around you. And those same kind of ideas apply to what we would do for governance. Um, some of the conversation that we've been a part of when it comes to vaccines and vaccine mandates on Twitter, I made a comment about protected classes, and that's really like, I made that because that's a part of the society that we live in, not because that's something that I would necessarily want in the society that is my ideal. And that fits with a lot of these other pieces that, government mandates are not something that I care for or think are good or appropriate, but they are what's here now. So, how do we work within the system that exists while continuing to work on building parallel power structures and working to help liberate people from the forces that continue to oppress them or hold them in a particular space, and do all these other things so that all of us can live free, beautiful, wonderful lives, you know? And like, that's one of the pieces that I keep coming back to, is that more than anything, I just want everybody to be free and be able to associate with whoever they would like to have the relationships that they desire. And like, I don't care. I don't care, like, if they engage in certain like lifestyle choices that I might not, that I myself might not participate in. But like, I'm a big fan of the non-aggression principle, that your rights end, that your right to swing your fist ends where my nose begins. That if the choices that we're making aren't harming other people, then I don't care. But I would like everybody to have that opportunity, and that there's enough in everybody's bowl. That's again where a lot of my love of permaculture comes from, because I see it as a place where we have the opportunity to create those structures, vehicles, places, organizations. Like, everything about permaculture comes together in such a meaningful way to see that kind of world in action. Um, and to be able to help really keep and make people free. Going back to something that Jason shared earlier, Nathan, which I don't think you were here for, we've been discussing as part of the live stream and also off air for much of today, the difference between negative and positive liberty. And that's where, like, for me, I'm much more of a positive liberty kind of person than I am necessarily like wanting everybody to be free to do anything at any time, and not having restrictions doesn't quite fit for me. Um, but I do feel that each community needs to be the ones who are making that decision, and the individuals who are inside of it. Um, Consensus. Oh man. Yeah, Nathan. NVC can be so terrible, and yeah, I like the basics of it, but there's just so much of it that can be so bad. What I run into when it comes to yes. Thank you, Nathan. That was the direction that I was going into. Is that I have largely found that, depending on the rules or structure for consensus myself, that it winds up, um, you can wind up with outgroups a lot of times. Um, or again, factions are rising, cliques that then can control the or dominate the conversation. But I mean, we have that with democracy, we have that with consensus. There, I do think though that there are ways to structure those so that they are less harmful, but it's just how do we want to get it there? Um, and like consensus to me ideally is that ultimately no one gets what they actually want, but everybody gets something that's a step towards what they want, um, ideally. But that's not how a lot of times it works in practice. Um, yeah, I'll have to dig into that a bit more about consensus and free association, Nathan. That's an interesting thought that I don't know that I've dug into the way that those would intersect. Um, because that's where, like, I've seen forms of consensus that use vetoes or um, like blackballs with secret votes and things like that, so that if there are people who feel that their needs haven't been met or that the community hasn't moved enough in a direction, that there are ways to stop the current vote and go back to discussion and continue to work it out. Um, yeah, I'd really like to know more about what you mean by consensus mixed with free association in this context as we've been kind of on today. Yeah, I can see that perspective as well. And I think with some of our decision making, also being able to just abstain, which may be a place where like the free association comes in as well. That if there's something that really matters to us, that we show up for that conversation and are a part of it. But if there's something that doesn't really that we don't really feel impacts us or something, that we can just step away. Yeah, well, when it comes to the system as it exists, I don't agree with most of that. But we've had those conversations, and you know that. Um, there's hmm, yeah, there's some pieces here, guys, that I really want to kind of think about and dig into. Ah, yes. Well, that being the one, Nathan, with what you're saying about imagine being part of a group of people and consistently being the only one who disagrees, then yeah, I can really see that because you should be able. That person who is continually disagreeing is likely in a space or a community that doesn't work for them or that is not appropriate for them. So the ability to find the group or organization or community, yeah, yeah, that would be really important. That's having mobility as part of these conversations is a piece of it too. Hmm. Yeah. Sorry, I'm not talking. I'm following this discussion in the chat. It's really fascinating, guys, um, because that's where I've thought quite a bit about like not only being able to walk away, but also choosing your level of participation. About a lot of intentional communities require you to buy in or buy out, but how do you make that transition easy? How do you make it if somebody wants to come in and be a part of your community simple, and if they want to leave easy as well? Um, so much about this. Maybe we will host a live call on Zoom or something, and rather than do this through chat and YouTube, we can actually have a deep conversation about governance sometime and consensus and decision making in some of these pieces. So many ways we can do this. But as it is 9:15 here on the East Coast, I believe everyone who's still participating, you're in the same time zone. Is there anything else you want to drop into the conversation before I call this to a close. I'm happy to run till about 9:30 or so, but yeah. If not, then go ahead and look at wrapping this up. But I do want to give a moment for you guys to respond if there's anything else you want to drop in here. And as we've said throughout, we can, of course, take this conversation to Twitter after the live stream. I can post some things at Permaculture Pod, or feel free to at me and start a conversation, and we'll see who else we can drag into the discussion. But I'm not quite sure what my delay is between where I am and what you're receiving at the moment, so I will give it another minute or so for you to drop anything else into the chat. Okay, I will check out Radical Anthropology. Thank you for the suggestion, Nathan. Also, while I'm giving you a moment for that, let me double check my calendar. There's another one of these here in a week or two. That will be in the next live stream will be next Thursday in 9 days, on Thursday the 16th. That's a midweek live stream at 3 p.m. to help with the other folks in the audience from around the world to be able to join in on a live stream. So then, Jason, you dropped, what's your opinion on MOBAs? In the moment, I don't know what the context is for what MOBA means. Let me see. Multi-online battle arenas? Is that what you were meaning, Jason? If so, I don't tend to play any of those. I've thought about dropping into League of Legends, especially after watching Arcane. One of my buddies really enjoys Dota 2. I did play a little Heroes of the Storm when that first dropped, but then there wasn't much of a community around it. I tend to play when I'm in the mood for something like that. I'm not sure if what I looked up is what you had in mind, but yeah, when it comes to those kinds of games, I actually prefer more of your battle arenas. I played PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds for a while. My son and I play Apex Legends quite a bit. We did play some Fortnite, but have moved largely to Legends and really enjoy that. Which, if you have stuck through this very long live stream to this point, if you want to connect, I am on Steam. If you'd like to friend me there and play video games together, just drop me a note, and we can connect. But yeah, no, Jason, when it comes to MOBAs, I haven't played them. I don't know why. I'll have to. Maybe I will look into one. But most of my playing over the years, like, I cut my teeth with role-playing games, both at the tabletop and computer, and then played a lot of first-person shooters through college, and I think that's why the arenas are so much fun. Like, way back in the Quake days, my friends and I played a lot of Quake and the various arena games that came out during that time. We had an amazing computer lab at my university in the late 90s where we could come in and play, all Friday night long. And so, yeah, cut my teeth on FPSs, and then the Battleground games seem like the closest continuation of those. Though, honestly, my favorite video game as a casual player is Warframe. I love dropping into a new frame, playing with its abilities, playing some PvE for a while, and just having some fun exploring maps and things. It's another game that my son and I play quite a bit. So yes, if you've stuck with us this long and play Warframe as well, let me know. Again, as always, you can send a text to 717-827-6266. That's also the number to call me. Feel free to send me an email, show@thepermaculturepodcast.com, if you have any questions or thoughts. if you're catching this live stream on a replay, then of course feel free to drop a comment in the page on YouTube, and I will catch it once it comes through. But yeah, take care, everybody. All my best to you, and we'll do this again soon. Take care.